trade, but especially the spice trade. And Venice got richer and richer by its participation in the spice trade. Spices would come overland, mostly from India, into the Middle East, and they'd be purchased in the Middle East by Venetian merchants, the main competition being Byzantine merchants up until the fall of Byzantium in 1453. Venice traded Florentine wool for these spices. So the Florentine woolen industry actually helped Venice become more wealthy because it gave them an entree into the spice trade. Venetian society was controlled by rich commercial families, just like Florentine society and every other town in Italy just about. These rich commercial families controlled the economy and they controlled politics. Unlike in Florence, though, these rich commercial families declared themselves to be nobles. So we do, in fact, have a nobility in Venice, whereas no such thing in Florence anymore. And government office, as well as many sectors of the economy, as we'll see, were limited to nobles. But these are not typical medieval nobles. These are not rural agricultural feuding nobles. These are rich commercial families who just want to be seen as at the top of society and who give themselves the designation of noble. There were a fixed number of noble families in Venice. There was no upward mobility into the class. So, that made for a stable society in a way, but it also meant that over the years, the nobility was going to shrink and shrink and shrink as families died off, as families generally do after a few generations, and no new families can move up. And this becomes a major problem for Venice as the noble class, the noble group, shrinks and becomes less able to govern and less able to manage the economy. But at least in the early Renaissance, this was not a major problem. It really didn't become a major problem until the 17th century in Venice. In Venice, only nobles could own ships, which meant that only nobles would be the ones profiting from the very wealthy maritime trade, particularly spice trade with the Middle East. Also, only nobles could engage in wholesale trade, which was the most prosperous kind of trade, even though other people could engage in retail trade. So it really is a commercial nobility, and it's profiting from this. The government of Venice is headed by an official, actually an elected official, called a doge. The doge is chosen from among, or elected, I guess you'd say, from among an elite group, small group of noble families. And he's the chief executive of the city. The legislative branch of government was called the Senate. That was an hereditary body of between 50 and 60 nobles, and it was the Senate who actually elected the doge. It was not a general election. The Senate would come together and elect the doge. And the Senate did not include all the noble families. It just included 50, 60 chosen noble families, I guess the most important ones, the ones closer to the top. There was another body called the Grand Council, which included representatives of all noble families. But this was really just a rubber stamp body. It didn't meet very often, didn't really make important decisions, and was largely controlled by the Doge and by the Senate. Well, the Doge and the Senate were obviously the two most important governing entities in Venice. And they governed by use of a very effective secret police force. There were spies throughout the city, there were policemen throughout the city, and people were watched and the society was regulated. The Doge himself lived in a huge palace on St. Mark's Square right next to the cathedral. And the palace has a very interesting thing on the front side of it. The official symbol of Venice was the Lion of St. Mark, because during the Crusades, the story was crusaders from Venice had gone and found the bones of St. Mark and brought them back to Venice and put them in the cathedral. And so Venice was known as the city of St. Mark, and his symbol was the lion. On the front of the Doge's palace, there was a little sconce kind of thing in the shape of a lion head with its mouth open. And what that was there for was that anybody in Venice who thought there was somebody disloyal to the city or not patriotic or not doing his duty, you could write down an anonymous accusation I think so-and-so is not a loyal Venetian. Don't have to sign your name to it. Put it through that lion head, and the officials in the Doge's palace are going to read it, put it through the mouth, they're going to read these accusations and send the secret police out to round people up, which happened. Right behind the Doge's palace, there's a bridge over a canal. There are no streets in Venice, it's all just canals. And over the canal right in back of the Doge's palace, there's this arched bridge called the Bridge of Sighs. And that's where they would take the essentially political prisoners, from the Doge's palace across to the prison and back, where people often spent many, many years locked up for very, comparatively small offenses. So Venice was a rigid society. The government was stable, but it was in the hands of a tiny minority. Nevertheless, it was a terrific center of Renaissance culture. So, it's not the dictatorship Milan was, but it's certainly not the republic and participatory kind of government that Florence was. Yet, it's a very important center for humanism, maybe the second most important after Florence, and a very important center for art, especially, and the growth of Renaissance culture. In the 1400s, 15th century, Venice becomes an even more important political force in Northern Europe as it expands onto the mainland. Now, I mentioned in an earlier lecture that one of the problems that Venice had was that being out there on those islands, every inch of land is built up. There's no open land. And so they don't have any place to plant food crops. They had depended for many years on the importation of food from the mainland, from various allied cities like Padua and Bologna and other areas, and they would just simply buy the food. But it was clearly not a very good situation for Venetian security. And the Venetians were sure that if they were ever besieged and that supply cut off, they probably couldn't supply their whole population by ship. And so in the 1400s, they set out to create an empire on the mainland in northern Italy. And they're kind of the successor of Milan in this attempt to form an empire in northern Italy. They have pretty much success trying to obtain land to grow food on, which they directly control and they can rely on. Unfortunately, they are blocked in their conquest by an alliance, the important North Italian alliance of Milan and Florence. And so Venice is ultimately unsuccessful in conquering any kind of mainland empire. Its efforts to do so pretty much end around 1500. And that's because the economy starts to have serious troubles in Venice around 1500. One of the reasons is the Turks have conquered a good part of the Middle East, and this has disrupted the spice trade and other elements of Venice's Mediterranean trade. So that's a problem. Another problem that we'll see developing more in the next lecture is that the Portuguese, first of all, that later the Dutch, actually find a way to intervene into the spice trade and cut off a good deal of the spice flow from Venice and take it back to their countries and profit from it. So these commercial setbacks really hurt the Venetian economy because it was so dependent on maritime trade. And like I said before, the fact that the nobility is shrinking, it's becoming less able to really govern, it's becoming less able to handle the economic system, the government's becoming ever more rigid. But even while all this is happening, Venice is still a very important center for Renaissance culture. Okay, so in the south, the two major powers, really the only two significant powers, are the Kingdom of Naples and the Papal States. So we'll talk just briefly about those two. The Kingdom of Naples is a very different place in Italy from anything in North Italy. And in many ways, it doesn't really fit in with the Italian Renaissance very well, although Naples itself had a Renaissance culture, the city of Naples. Kingdom of Naples is a feudal monarchy. It has a king in charge of it. It has a class of nobles. It's a rural agricultural state. And in that sense, it really resembles a lot of Northern European states, much more than it resembles the North Italian city-states and even Central Italian city-states. So it's a very different place. It also has passed through a number of different hands over the years. In 1054, the Normans, who come from the north of France, conquer Sicily, and then later Naples, which Naples and Sicily make up the Kingdom of Naples. These Normans are the same ones who a few years later, from the same place, who a few years later will conquer England. The Normans rule Sicily and Naples for a number of years. And the dynasty is an Angevin dynasty. They don't change very much. They just rule the area. Then in 1434, King Alfonso of Aragon invades Naples and conquers it, and he becomes the king. Now in 1434, Spain is not a unified monarchy, but Aragon is among the 2 or 3 most important kingdoms in Spain, and so they have now expanded into Naples, and they become kings of Naples, so it becomes a Spanish monarchy. In 1498, the line of Aragon, the dynasty of Aragon in Naples, dies out. And that's the opportunity that we see King Charles of France taking to claim the throne of Naples. He simply says, look, we conquered it back in 1054, we French, we Normans, there was an Angevin dynasty there, we have as much right to it as anybody else. Of course, the Spanish Aragonese also said, well, we have a right to the throne too, and there was a local claimant to the throne as well. So in order to actually establish power in Naples, Charles had to invade, and we've seen that he did invade in 1498. He marches south with his huge army, conquers Milan, conquers Florence. You get Savonarola coming in Florence. He makes it all the way down to Naples, and he actually conquers Naples and establishes himself on the throne of Naples. But he finds that he can't stay there, that he's got to go back to France and tend to his duties as ruler of France. Because, as we'll see later on, the King of France is not yet powerful enough to be gone from the country for such a long time and not have trouble develop. So not long after he conquers Naples, he makes his way back north through Italy again, this time in a much more peaceful way, not having to conquer everybody for a second time. And after he leaves, the French claim just collapses. And in 1503, the Aragonese come back. In this case, it's Ferdinand of Aragon who conquers Naples, and once again, Spain controls Naples. So Naples goes back and forth. It later on passes into the inheritance of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The only other power we need to mention right now, the only other major power in the south, the Papal States. A very unusual power because, first of all, it's not one state, it's really a series of small states, and they stretch in a line from Rome in the south, kind of doing an S shape up to Ravenna in the north, so right through the middle of Italy. They're all directly controlled by the Pope. He is their secular ruler. The Pope got these territories in the Middle Ages, in the early Middle Ages. They used to be controlled by the Byzantines when the Byzantines had invaded Italy. The Franks conquered them from the Byzantines. The Franks, the King Pepin of the Franks, gave them to the Pope as a donation of Pepin, and the Pope then made them into the Papal States. The Pope depended on these Papal States for the revenues to run the church, as we've already seen, but he also depended on these states for troops and for money to defend Rome and defend the church against its foreign enemies, because the church was essentially a secular political player and needed a power base from which they could draw recruits and draw money, taxes, and put an army in the field and maintain the church's independence. This had become very apparent during the Middle Ages, during the clash with the Holy Roman Emperor. So the Papal States was an essential part of the Pope's power, and it not only helped him run the church, it also made him a major political player, a major secular ruler in South Central Italy.